Hello everybody, again, we're going to get into chapter 5 today. So what I wanted to take a look at is sort of the summary. I'll kind of go over a review generally what chapter 5 is about. Then it'll kind of help you all as you go through the reading yourselves, or if you've already done the reading, this could act as a supplement to kind of get you through some of the main questions to take a look at the themes we've been talking about and how this connects to our overall discussion so far in the class. So today we're going to take a look at chapter 5, which is the sources of knowledge. So one of the main things we're going to talk about here is really the underlying question of how do we know what we know? It's really the underlying question. So we've kind of brought this question up before as we've gone through the class, but as we start to assert ourselves and describe our own philosophies, it inevitably comes up in a discussion of philosophy on how do we know that? And often we will give some maybe initially superficial answers, and we get down to the very base of it. If you go down along any line of inquiry long enough, eventually get to this question of how do we know that? How do we know for sure that we know this? How sure can we be? And essentially it's going to go down to two different lanes. And we've been talking about aspects of these throughout, but we're really going to focus on them. One of them will be the senses. Like we've talked about those before, as far as seeing, smelling, feeling, hearing, and how these senses are the basis for us knowing something. Essentially distilling to the argument that I don't know something unless I could see it, feel it, or taste it. The other route that people go is of the mind, of thinking it. So kind of like the Descartes, I think therefore I am quote that we've come back to, the sort of foundational idea for this is not so much even being able to trust our senses, that maybe how we see something could be wrong, how we hear or smell something could betray us, but rather focusing on how we think about it and how that interacts with our mind. And some of them actually go in between the two, like how the senses can inform our mind, but they would either go on one or the other. Like the mind is foundational or the senses are foundational. So really, again, this is just how we understand ourselves and how we interact with the world is sort of fundamentally what we're taking a look at. And as you go through this, you can pause and ask yourself, perhaps which of these makes more sense to you? Or if you kind of, as you go through this, if it challenges your way of thinking that maybe the senses are more important than you initially thought, or perhaps your mind is something that really affects how you might think about something. So, in one sense, this is a deeply philosophical discussion, the essence of understanding something, but in another sense, really is a fundamental question of our day-to-day lives. You know, we could begin to really question on how we make decisions, who influences us, and how we may arrive at the correct choice. As far as we go through our day, you know, who's telling us what, where are we getting our information from, how does media affect us, and how all of these things influence us in our understanding of the world. So as we go through this, looking at these questions, we're going to take a few different points, which are each basically a subsection of this chapter. So why knowledge is a problem. We'll go through some of the questions as to why knowledge itself is even questioned in philosophy. Is reason the source of knowledge? And this is more along the lines of Descartes' idea of mind. And then the second one would be the senses. Can the senses account for all of our knowledge? A little bit more of the scientific framework of not really being able to understand something unless we could feel it, touch it, smell it, or see it. And finally, the last one is sort of this mind versus materialism. So two different camps, kind of asking yourself which one you may fall under. Do you fall under the mind as being the essential aspect of understanding who we are? Or perhaps do you see the materialist understanding of things? Do you have to feel it, touch it, and see it for it to make sense to you? Okay, so let's go down to the first one. Why knowledge could potentially be a problem. So this is a pretty large section here, but I want to emphasize two parts here. So anything we talk about emphasizes the idea of knowledge being relative. relative knowledge, this first aspect here, that we don't necessarily have anything concrete. When you start asking questions of how do we know something, how certain are we that our senses are telling us the truth, they start to bring doubt in our minds of whether we could actually know something. Which, in some senses, if you don't have absolute knowledge, there is the problem of one person being able to assert their knowledge over others, or you even being able to doubt whether something is good or bad. So, for instance, if you can't really know what something is true or not, whether something is true or not, how could you assert whether one thing is better than the other? Or how could you actually say that it's good, something is essentially good or something is essentially bad? And this applies to real questions like violence or hurting somebody. Is hurting somebody always bad? If things are relative and you can't say for sure, then where do we go with morality, right? So this idea of relative knowledge, and it's real consequences in the world. Okay, so this initial section here, a problem with knowledge is whether or not we can be sure that we know something. Can we be sure of our own memories? How do we know something happened? For instance, if we remembered something incorrectly or forgot it completely, how might this affect our world? And the interesting example they give here, which philosophers like to do, is to give a sort of thought experiment for us to take a look at his problem more deeply. This case, they talk about repressed memories and recovered memories. So essentially the author is giving this idea that this phenomena, which is controversial, some people believe it, some people don't, scientists argue one way or the other, but the essential phenomena is what happens if you have memories that you've repressed. And he gives an instance of there being trauma that a person has suffered, and they repress the memory, or they essentially forgot it until it comes about through intensive therapy. And in the therapy, they're able to remember these things, and it forces them to completely relive or rethink their childhood. So if you go that route, this repressed memory, then what do you do with that? If you forgot something, how does that change who you are? If you fundamentally thought you had a relatively uneventful childhood or was a good childhood, what happens then if you have to reframe that? Or alternatively, what happens if these, because as some scientists would argue, that these recovered memories are false, that there's a phenomena of you going through the process of trying to remember a trauma and it being fabricated. So it doesn't actually happen, but you start thinking that it did. And what does that happen? If you have these recovered memories then of something that didn't actually happen, what does that do? So if you start reframing your childhood as something that was bad rather than good, and you actually come to find out that it was actually a false recovery. So where does this go? This idea of having to re-narrate our present, rethinking ourselves, rethinking our relationship with our family members perhaps, rethinking how we relate with our friends and family, and if that was false. So this is this idea of having real consequences. Though the memories themselves in some ways are fictitious, whether they're true or not, a memory is, in a sense, not something you could actually hold on to. It's something that in some cases could, if it was forgotten, not affect you at all, or if something that's remembered even falsely can give you actual consequences. For instance, in the example, he talks about the person who recovered their memories remembered abuse from their parents and family members, which forced them to abandon those relationships. So this sort of remembering those things, whether falsely or not, changed and had real effects in the world. So while this may be just a problem of the mind, it has real consequences in the real world. So this idea of misremembering can change real things in the real world, or even misknowing. Another example I might give is someone being accused of being a witch at the times of like the Salem witch trials. So in the case of whether you're a witch or not, if you're accused of it, if enough people in your community were to think of you as a witch, or to act towards you as a witch, and try you as a witch, then in reality then, you are essentially a witch, whether you were or not. Your consequences are real. So there's real pain and real suffering as the cause of memories, or ideas. So all these are really to underline this idea. So how can we be sure that we know what we know? If we aren't certain about our knowledge, it could cause us to reframe our own stories, our own family lives and social lives, perhaps falsely. Or in the cases of people in our community, the marginalized or the oppressed, it may actually cause us to treat them poorly when in reality there's nothing actually deserved or going on here. Okay, so that's one of the essential problems then of knowledge is it's not just a philosophical one, it has real consequences. So if we're to go over here then. So how do we get knowledge? So this is one of the two versions I was talking about, the two ways of knowing. Rationalism, this is the mind one, so the Descartes, I think therefore I am, versus empiricism, this is the scientist one, where you actually, I would summarize it as I don't know it unless I can see it, feel it, smell it, or hear it, or in some ways actually interact with it. So the how do we get knowledge? Rationalism is the official term of the mind. View that knowledge of the world can be attained by relying on reason without the aid of the senses. So in a sort of objective sense, folks in this camp of being rationalists think that they can understand the world without relying on the senses. Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Moreover, if you take this a little bit further, many of them would argue that the senses themselves may actually be something that deceives the mind. So you'd be better off relying on your own mind rather than relying on your senses, which could be tricked. You could think of something like an optical illusion. If someone shows you a picture that's fabricated, we may see these things online, something that's photoshopped and not real, that these senses actually deceive us. So we may be better off from a rationalist perspective to rely on our minds rather than relying on our senses. The opposite camp, empiricism. This is essentially, empiricism would be like, I would define it as the framework of the sciences. Science and empiricism are basically the same idea. The knowledge of the world can only be obtained through the senses. So a scientist doesn't really care so much in any real sense of what the mind says or what the mind thinks, of what someone's subjectivity says, of what your experience of something is. Because that doesn't matter as much, because your perception of things are basically, until proven, are just that, one person's perspective. Scientists, in a sense, are trying to find more broad versions of truth that can be observed generally by many people. So again, scientists thinking, I don't know it unless I could see it, feel it, smell it, or hear it. Okay. So, in thinking of this, I'll highlight this section here. Do either of these make more sense to you? Like if I were to throw these out there, and you were to kind of make a gut decision, which of these make more sense to you? And kind of connecting this with a broader idea of what is your philosophy? Do you find yourself to be more of a rationalist? Where your mind is something you could rely on more, your sense of something, or maybe more your senses on how you don't really believe something unless you could feel it, touch it, or see it. Which of these are your inclinations? And if you were to pick one or the other, what are the consequences of that? Meaning, if you were to say, I'm only a rationalist and I don't trust my senses, what consequences might that have in the world? Versus the opposite, if you think I could only trust things that I could feel, see, and touch, what would be consequences of that? For instance, what's the status of some spiritual beliefs or the status of God if you could only believe in things that you could feel, touch, or see? So what are the consequences of these? Okay. The next step. So what is the place of memory then? So if we were to think of both these things, as we had covered earlier, memory can be deceiving, whether it's a recovered memory or a falsely recovered memory, a fabricated memory. What are the consequences of these, and what are different ways, perhaps, the philosophers think of memory? Okay, so they have three of them. habit memory, ability to remember how to do something. So this would be if, the saying or this idea that if you learn how to ride a bike, you never forget. If you hop back on a bike, you could get your balance again. You don't have to relearn it every time. So this idea of in some cases, in some sense, your body remembering a habit. If you hop on a bike and start moving. So that's one of them, habit memory. Second one, that kind of is our own story, our personal memory. So something that we tell about ourselves, whether it was something we remember from our childhood, experiences at school, experiences before school, experiences growing up in your household, recalling a representation of events that we personally experience. So it's something you experienced and not something you necessarily learned about the world. It's something your personal interaction with things. This is different from something like factual memory, the final one. So this is like recalling historical facts about the world that may not directly affect us. And the example that the author gives here is something like facts about history, like about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. We don't necessarily experience these directly, but we understand them as by way of reading a book about them, having our teacher tell us about them, or our parents, older brother or sister, friends talk about these events. And this is how we learn about facts. So these three things together, factual memory, personal memory, and habit memory, are all ways of us forming our understanding about our environment. So putting these three things together may inform us about how we interact with the world, whether at a personal level or historical level. Okay, coming back around. So going deeper then. So one of the, so this next section, we're going to go a little bit deeper into one of the two ways of knowing. And this, in this side, is reason and knowledge. So this is for the rationalists, or people that see the world by way of the mind. So these aren't the folks that are concerned with the senses as much, but they're more inclined to how the mind works and how we think about things. So, do we need to experience things in the world to have knowledge? So, one of the key questions that comes up in this framework is, how can you know something if you have yet to experience it? So if you go far enough in, and you might ask a rationalist, if everything is just in the mind, then it would seem you don't actually need to go experience anything. Meaning, you should be able to think about the meaning of life without actually having to go in and experience the world. So technically, from this perspective, it seems like a person who sits in their room writing about things knows just as much about the world as someone who goes and travels. So something about this doesn't necessarily seem right. So we're trying to get a little bit deeper into what a rationalist might have to say about this. So one of the good examples is they start rationalists that are sort of forced to break knowledge down into several categories, break experience down into several categories. One of the examples that illustrates this, that the author gives, which is pretty good, is biologists versus mathematicians. So for instance, a biologist or astronomer, in order for them to really do well at their work, they actually have to go out in the world and look at it. So for instance, a biologist isn't going to be very good about explaining plant or animal species unless they're out there in the world working with them. While a mathematician, if you were to go down and become, work as a professional mathematician, in reality, you really wouldn't have to leave your room. You could sit in your room or your office at your desk with a pen and paper and essentially do all of your work. So you could know as a mathematician things without having to leave or experience the world. Or whereas a biologist would actually have to go out and experience the world directly. So, well, I guess so both is technically experiencing thinking about things versus going out into the world. There's something seemingly very different about these two ideas. Okay, so if then a rationalist is forced to say, okay, so if I'm going to argue that I don't necessarily need experiences, how then does experience and thinking make a person a person? How do they influence who somebody is? So to break it down into a few different things. So one of them is uh, a priori knowledge. So this is a type of knowledge that is essentially, this is something that just exists in our minds. So a priori knowledge, or if you were to break it down, before knowledge, suggests that things just pre-exist in our minds. So something that can be primordial, or something that is about just the basis of thinking, the basis of understanding, as Plato would go on to say, something like understanding shapes. Like we have an innate understanding of a square or a circle, that if you kind of talk it out with somebody, a child or most people would be able to pull out this idea of a shape of a triangle or a square just by talking it out. They would know it. Something exists deeply in us for things like time or space that are just there in us without really having to experience it. We just know it is by way of just talking about it. So this is one way they solve it, is by way of saying you don't necessarily need to experience the world like an empiricist might say. A rationalist would say some knowledge is just there. It's a part of who we are. We're born with it. So I guess I would basically say that a priori knowledge is something you're born with. So some of the subtleties, many rationalists would still acknowledge that we do still learn from our experiences. So most of them would say that, of course, if you go out into the world and something happens to you, you're going to learn from it. Many would argue that this somehow gets connected to the knowledge that we already have. So we kind of come in with I guess, in a computer or software comparison, preloaded with a bunch of knowledge. And as we experience the world, these new experiences get cataloged away with the old experiences. For instance, if you go in and you're cooking for the first time and you feel the heat of a fire, and maybe you burn your hand, or your parent warns you about burning your hand, that one experience of the heat is something hopefully enough to catalog in your memory and upload as something to recall and not to worry about again, or not to or something to worry about next time you encounter something hot. The fire is hot, it should be avoided. So danger being connected with your a priori knowledge. Okay. So then one of the questions that comes out of this then, which leads us to they talk about the empirical stuff, is how can we trust our senses to accurately depict the world? Part of the problem here, if you talk about from this framework, is though you may experience something like hot or cold or something in the world, how do we know that our senses are telling us the truth? I guess you could think of the same example of a parent warning you that something is hot. What if they gave you that warning about something else that was false? You could imagine that someone could tell you something false, and you could go about the rest of your life worrying about running into that thing again and have it not actually be a problem. For instance, if you got warned that, I don't know, grass was poisonous or something, and you wouldn't want to touch it, and you go about the world avoiding grass because it was something you thought was poisonous. So how can we know to trust our senses? Or even if we actually stepped on the grass and we had a reaction to it, how do we know our body is just playing tricks on us, type of thing? So how reliable are our senses? And can we rely on the outside world or experiences to make sense of ourselves and to others? Is a question. Question for you to think about. How reliable are our senses? Okay. So part of this then leads to this idea, because we start worrying about our senses, the rationalists take it a bit further. So while many rationalists will stop at the idea of, I can't know my world reliably, I can only know it through my mind and through thinking about things. Some of them go even farther and they go into something called skepticism. This idea that they believe in the mind so strongly they actually think that the world and our senses are completely unreliable. They're very skeptical about our surroundings. So this idea then, Descartes' conclusion of I think therefore I am, really comes from his skepticism or his doubt and certainty about whether or not we can rely on our faculties. So he imagines that there could be, essentially the way he talks about this, is there could be some evil being that gives us false images of the world. Therefore suggests that perhaps all we have to rely on is our own reason. That we have to think things through because we're not really sure, because in reality, our whole reality could be based on a lie. I guess, and I think the book gives this example too. You could think of a movie like The Matrix, if you all have seen that one, whereas what the protagonist finds out is that the whole world is in fact just a computer simulation. That in the reality, our senses are being deceived, and we have to actually take ourselves away from that to actually get a true sense of the world. So this is essentially what Descartes talking about hundreds of years ago, is that how can we actually rely on our senses, and when in fact they could be just deceiving us, and all we have left is our mind. So if you go far enough down this route, that's what rationalists begin to worry about. Not only do they prioritize thinking and rationalism, but they really fear or worry about the reality of the senses. So if we can't rely then on our observations or our senses, and we're just left with these ideas that we get that are there from birth, those innate ideas we talked about. So Plato talks about these innate ideas. It might just take us some time to remember these ideas. So the way Plato talks about these things then, and he does it through one of his dialogues, is this idea of talking through with a person about these ideas and helping them reveal them. So arguing in some ways, kind of like this in Eastern philosophy, Jainism, is that basically people are born with all knowledge. That essentially we have all this knowledge in us, and in some ways it just takes the right person, experience, or a thought process for these ideas or this knowledge to be pulled out. So Jainism is a historical belief system, a religion, that basically we as humans have all knowledge. And by living morally or ethically, we can begin to recall this long-standing knowledge. And we recall it by interacting with people ethically and morally. So this idea then that all knowledge is in us, we're born with all of it. It's just a matter of these experiences pulling them out. So in some ways they sort of, I think, bridge the gap between trying to understand the world between mind and senses, is that they essentially need both. So we recall through our connection with others. So if we pause here for a moment, how does this notion sit with you? Do you like this idea or relate with this idea that all knowledge is within us and essentially it just has to be pulled out? Or does that seem not quite true to you? Okay, so maybe we'll pull this through. To the other end, so if this doesn't seem to sit right with you, what happens then if we were to look into our senses? The idea of can our senses account for all of our knowledge? And this is the view of the empiricist, the person who, like a scientist, who believes that we can only know things by thinking, or not by thinking, but by experiencing them through smelling, seeing, touching, and feeling them, is the only true way we can know things about our world, because our mind can play tricks on us. Okay, so the empirical view is the notion that senses form the basis of our knowledge. So the question then, what does knowledge look like from this view? So it's the opposite end of the previous one. There was a priori. This is a posteriori knowledge, meaning that the knowledge comes after the fact, which all it is actually saying is we have an experience, that's number one, and then we have knowledge that comes out of that. That's number two. So whereas a priori you have knowledge and then you have an experience, a posteriori is you have the experience, then you get knowledge from that. So consequently then, from this perspective, knowledge begins to unfold as we interact with the world. So you're not really born with anything, except for some empiricists may say we have some basic knowledge. But essentially, real knowledge only unfolds as we interact with the world. We gain most of our essential basic types of knowledge, such things that the author gives as the sky is blue, grass is green, by being in the world. But at the same time, we're also able to build deeper realms of knowledge by these sciences and our understanding of the natural world through ongoing interaction with it. So we start off learning the very basic things, maybe learning language by experiencing the world, learning from teachers and parents, family members. Then we start building upon this as a foundation with more experiences. Well, the more experiences we have, the more we interact with these things, the more we could end up knowing about the world. So let's go a little bit further down then. So what are the consequences of this then? Is we have uh, innate knowledge. So the consequences then of what empiricists would say is we're not born with innate knowledge like um, as the rationalists would say, but rather we're born with a blank slate. We don't have any type of knowledge that we're born with. We're born as a tabula rasa. A blank slate meaning we don't really have any inherent knowledge. We're open to everything. So consequently, humans are therefore infinitely malleable, changeable beings. We are at the beginning of our lives of open potential, but our development is then constrained by the experiences that we have. That's all really just to say is as babies, we're neither good nor bad. We're neither smart nor lacking knowledge. That as we begin to experience things from interaction with our parents, with our environment, as we grow up with teachers and schools, religious institutions, and just any experience that we have in our lives. This starts to build knowledge. This starts to build basics and more developed things. Okay? So, one of the questions you might be thinking, one of the potential objections here that I think the book rightly points out is that unless we do something ourselves, how can we actually know something? So what are the things you might say if you read about an idea, if you've ever read an instruction manual of how to do something before doing it, how do you actually, how could you do that without knowing it? So basically saying that anything we've ever learned secondhand from somebody or learned tangentially or heard about, how could we actually know that without experiencing it? So if you really go a full direction on this and reduce everything to experiences, then it sort of starts to run into the problem of experiences have to be the basis of everything, meaning that you can't actually have any real knowledge unless you experience it yourself. Okay? So how about that? Let's pause there for a second. Does this seem logical to you? Does this make sense? Can you think of an example where we know something without experiencing it? What sorts of examples can you give for this? And if you identified more clearly with the empirical way of understanding the world, how might you solve this problem? Or if you were on the other end of it, you're a rationalist, how might you maybe inform the empiricists and maybe make this perspective a little bit stronger? How would you solve this problem? Okay. So we go a little bit further down this lane then. David Hume, one of his things that he brings up within this kind of question then is that he actually goes very extremely into the empiricist form and suggests there may not actually even be a world outside of our perceptions. Meaning that, if we only have our senses, how do we really know anything about the outside world? So he essentially says then, how do we know that the world isn't anything but a set of habits? So basically then, even if we're used to the sun rising every morning, how do we know that's actually a thing other than just a habit? We grow accustomed to the sun rising every morning. And then we just start to say, well, things are always going to be that way. Up here, things will always be that way. They have always been that way, and they will always be that way. So just because we grow accustomed to something, or experience something 1,000 times, doesn't necessarily mean it actually exists in the world. It just has been that way. It just tends to be that way. So basically then, if the world exists independently from us, but rather, what if these were just habits and we just got used to it? So Hume's saying that we can't really ever experience the world but it just exists out there. And we just, kind of get used to things sort of being away, and we just kind of play it by ear every day. How does that seem to you? What do you think about this perspective? Does this seem reasonable to you? Is this a perspective that makes sense? What problems do you see with this? Has Hume gone too far here? Or how about we pull Hume back a little bit? What do you think about that one? Okay. So if we go down a little bit further then. So how does this make up a world, and what does this mean for us? So we've got to think about all these different things, these different ideas we've talked about so far. So does our knowing mind shape the world? Question one. Does our knowing mind shape the world? This would be a rationalist view. So there are a few subtleties here, just to kind of go a little bit deeper into both perspectives. One of them is transcendental idealism. This one's sort of a combination of the two. So this one's trying to pull Hume back a little bit. So the thinking mind arranges the world on one end. Thinking mind arranges the world, arranges our senses. But the senses are the source of these sensations. So they kind of try to do a little bit of both. Basically, that we are essentially rationalists. Our thinking mind is the thing that arranges things. It organizes things. But we still gain all of our knowledge or our input from our senses. So if you think about going into the world and you experience green grass, and then you experience green trees, your mind organizes these two things, and maybe you could come up with greenness, or the color green, because it experiences two different instances of green and categorizes it like that. So while the senses, we see green grass, we see green trees, but our mind makes sense of it. So it tries to have both. Transcendental idealism. So in a way, the senses are like raw data that our mind makes sense of. It's of course shaped by our beliefs and our experiences. So we interact with the outside world, but this is only arranged based on our perceptions. Okay. So as far as, and one of the example other than greenness and the green tree that I give, the author also gives an example of cooking an egg. So each of those instances aren't necessarily connected. So you start off with a whole and broken egg, and then you experience the breaking of the egg, putting it in a pan, and then scrambling it up, and end up at the very end of it putting a cooked scrambled egg on your plate. So these separate things, the whole egg, the broken egg, the scrambled egg, are all three separate things. And if you were to look at each of those, they don't look the same. But because we saw the process, our mind understood the process of going from one form to the next, we understand then the process of cooking. So we're able to take each individual experience of one, the whole egg, two, the cracked egg, and three, the cooked egg, and be able to understand that the process of cooking is something that looks like that. So we understand the process of this as connective tissue of the event. So we start seeing these together. So if I were to ask this then, so what does this mean? How do you take this? How do seemingly random events come to form our understanding of the world by making rational connections? How does this sit with you? Okay, so then this view is called phenomenalism or phenomenology. So this is a form of the rationalism from before, but it's connected with the senses. So it's rationalism connecting the senses. So basically the phenomenon or the things we have in the world. We may not actually have access to the real world. So it kind of takes the idea of what Hume was saying seriously. Maybe we don't actually know the real world, but we have an impression of it. So while we can't absolutely say that we know the world, we have a pretty good idea of it. So our senses give us an idea, our mind makes sense of it, and between these two things, we come up with a pretty good sense of how the world actually is. Okay, so given this then, would you possibly consider yourself a phenomenologist? Do you think you have access to a true world? Do you think you could ever access how the world actually is? Or as a phenomenologist, do you think you could only get a basic idea of it? How does this sit with you? Okay. So the next question then, question 2, goes in the idea of empiricists. Can science actually provide us with reliable knowledge? So the empirical version of this is building up knowledge from the ground up. So scientific knowledge takes the empirical view of the world, where we need to build up from observations of actual world to build our knowledge. So for instance, you can't actually say that, it gets back to the egg example. You can't talk about a cooked egg unless you actually go make the observations yourself. Maybe take 5 different eggs, break them, cook them 5 different ways, and come up with this idea that yes, there does seem to be a phenomena of cooking. So science, or just think of the scientific method of experimentation. So you need experiments to prove the phenomena. So science is a way of framing the world from the ground up. That knowledge can only be obtained by taking little pieces, very directly observable facts like seeing something, feeling something, and putting those together. And if you combine these in enough different ways, over time, you could have bigger knowledge about bigger scientific facts you may or may not be able to directly observe, like building up ideas like gravity, the idea of observing and the apple falling, of Newton observing the apple falling, and doing that experiment enough times to make those observations to start saying that something like gravity could exist. So science then, can this idea, if you take a bunch of little things, how trustworthy is this, in your opinion, of being able to understand our world, building up from smaller events to bigger processes? So essentially then, framing the method is, the testing of empiricism, is hypothesis building and a creative guess based on available information. So if we're to summarize this, the body of scientific knowledge builds over time, creating a general view of the world, embodiment of the empirical view. Consequently, this view may be changed if you get new evidence or radical new interpretation of the evidence. So this is how empiricists account for change. So if you think about generally we view the world in one way, and then all of a sudden a new great scientific discovery could come about the world. So if you were to think of something that, I don't know, were to disprove gravity, or something really big would happen, that would force us to rethink everything. So this, in this framework then, it's called a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift is essentially what a revolution is in the sciences. That all of a sudden some fundamental piece that was at the very foundation of the knowledge, something down here changes, and therefore you have to rethink everything that you built on top of it. So when something down here changes, you have to rethink everything that comes up on above. So going down a little bit further. So where do you sit with this? So this is the basic thing. If we were to go around and look at this whole perspective, where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on the nature of knowledge? Do you think of yourself in the mind and the rational? Do you think of yourself with the senses and the empirical? Maybe somewhere in between. Basically, overall, is you're thinking about, in your writing, you're thinking about this chapter, as you're thinking about your own philosophy, which perspective makes the most sense to you? Do you tend to relate to the world with the rationalist view, the empiricist view? How about the fundamental questions? Can you rely on the senses? Does our mind create the world around us? Which one of these are you more skeptical of? Do you trust your mind more? Do you trust your senses more? How does this fit with your overall philosophy? So thinking back about the original papers you wrote, about how you view the world, about your goals, and how you think the world should be, what your family thinks and what your friends think, how does rationalism or empirical view fit with that? How does this fit with things like faith, if you consider yourself a person of faith? Or even more generally, spirituality. How do you have spirituality within these frameworks? How does this connect with your morality, right? And even back to the very beginning of this, what are the consequences of our memories? How does our own perception shape the world? How can we know this? So you don't have to answer all of these, but I think there's probably enough here for you to think about. And maybe go back to the chapter and look at some of these authors and what they're saying. Look back about what Kant or Hume were saying about these things. And what happens when you start to doubt your senses? If you doubt your ability to know the world, if you doubt your own memories, or if you think the only way to know the world is through your mind or through your senses. How does this affect your philosophy, and how does this affect your view of the world? So overall, you consider yourself a rationalist, an empiricist, and how does this fit with your general philosophy?